Hey, everybody. Welcome to Odd and Untold, the podcast where we talk about all things strange and spooky. And this week, I'm doing some revisiting of some Connecticut strangeness. Specifically, if you've seen the title of this video, UFOs in Connecticut. And I'm going to be discussing three separate cases of very famous UFO sightings in Connecticut. But before I get to that, I just want to talk a little bit about some personal stuff that brought me to this for this week's episode. And you'll notice I'm wearing my happy camper hat for this episode, and I'm not a happy camper. I mentioned a few weeks ago on one of the podcasts that I was going on vacation. I was going back to Bantam Lake, and we were going to do some camping. Myself, my dad, my son, my uncle Neil, and we were supposed to go for like 3 nights, 4 nights. We always do that every year. We try to get up there. But this year there was a little fly in the ointment. So I'm going to tell this story just because it's funny and therapeutic for me to tell it. So, and I'll tell you kind of how I got to this week's story. So we decided to go. We went up on Monday. I believe that was August 15th. So we went up on Monday. The weather forecast looked pretty good. There was a slight chance of rain for that afternoon. And I think, again, maybe Tuesday morning, there was like a 50% chance of like a passing shower. So we said, yeah, let's go up. It's a 3-hour drive. So we, packed up the cars, left early, got up there, set up our camp. Tents went up very nice. I went into town. I got some provisions, ice and charcoal and all that good stuff. Our wood guy, Steve, who was supposed to come Tuesday morning, couldn't make it. So he says, hey, I'm going to send out my friend to drop off your wood Monday night. So guy comes with the wood Monday night, a quarter cord of wood. So for like 3 nights, a lot of wood. We like to go usually late into the night with our campfires and build them up. And, $100 later, a quarter cord of wood. I had brought some wood too from one of my previous camping trips that we didn't use. So I had like 3 bundles of wood plus this quarter cord. So a lot of wood. So we get up there, we have dinner. As the night is going on, the weather forecast is changing. And now for Litchfield and Bantam, Connecticut, we were up at Bantam Lake. They're calling for a flood watch overnight. So now we're getting a little nervous. The weather up there tends to be very iffy. I mean, there's been years we've canceled the entire trip because they called for rain all day, every day. And then we stay here in New York and we watch the weather and it's just sunny, sunny, sunny. Like the rain just never showed up, but we cancel the trip and we miss out on a good trip. And then other times the weather says sunny, 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 and we go up there and we get rained out. So a lot of that. And then there's been times we've had to leave a day early. Last year was great. We stayed the entire time and we're very appreciative of that. We had a great trip, a lot of swimming, a lot of cool campfires, a lot of stars in the night sky. And I'll link to an episode from last year that you guys can kind of see. We went looking for the Bantam Lake UFO, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit here. So anyway, we have our campfire and it's cloudy, but not raining. And then at certain points, it like starts drizzling here or there very lightly, but nothing too bad. So we throw the tarps over the tents and my dad covers his tent with a huge tarp, and the tarp that I got was slightly bigger than the footprint of my tent. So it covered it, but not the whole tent. And we'll get back to that. So we go to bed and my son and I just fall asleep very quickly. It was just so comfortable. We have the air mattresses. I mean, this is kind of glamping. It's not really what like Josh and I do up in the Adirondacks, which is, deep woods, sort of primitive camping. This is car camping, glamping. We had air mattresses and pillows and blankets and just very comfortable. So later in the night, probably 1:30 in the morning, the rain is just coming down torrentially. It's probably the hardest rain I've experienced up there since I was a kid. It was just coming down nonstop, pouring rain. And I'm checking the tent, and so far I was dry at about 1:30 in the morning. No water coming in. And I was just hoping that the rain would ease up and then we'd be okay. It did not happen. So it kept raining. It kept raining. It kept raining. I wake up again about 4 in the morning and now I have water in my tent. So there's a puddle down kind of at the front of the tent. the front corner near my air mattress. And because my air mattress is up against the walls of the tent, it's getting moisture on it because the water's coming in from the walls of the tent. So I'm looking around and I say, what can I do? It's raining. It's pouring. I'm not snoring, but my son was sound asleep. And I moved my air mattress away from the walls of the tent. His air mattress looked dry. So I said, oh, okay, he'll be okay. I picked up our bags because our bags are starting to get wet from the puddle on the floor, and I put them on our air mattresses. And I lay there and I'm just listening to the rain. And like 20 minutes later, the right corner of my tent collapses. I hear this, the wind really just picked up and it was flapping my tarp. And for a brief moment, I thought my father and my uncle had gotten up and were throwing another tarp over my tent, because that's just the type of guy my dad is. He's just always looking out for us with the tarps. And I thought it was him because it just sounded like somebody was flapping a tarp and trying to throw it over my tent. And then I realized it was the wind, and the wind knocks down the right front corner of my tent and it just kind of collapses. So now I'm like, all right, I have to get up and fix this because this is not my dad, unfortunately. Now, it was very warm that night, so I'm sleeping in nothing but my briefs. So little image for the ladies there. So I get up and I slip on my brown Timberland sandals, and I have a poncho, and it's one of these cheap, like $1.99 ponchos you get from Walmart. It's basically cellophane in the rough approximation of a hoodie. So I throw that on, I throw on my headlamp, and I go outside. So I'm just in my underwear and the cellophane clear see-through poncho, headlamp, and brown slippers, sandals. And I go outside and I right the tent, I put it back up, I stake it down, seam secure. So I go back inside, take off the wet poncho, take off the wet slippers, get back into bed. The rain is not letting up. It is just pouring rain. So 10 minutes later, the tent collapses again. So I got to put everything back on again, my clear cellophane poncho that's wet now, and my sandals and my headlamp, and I go back outside. And I'm trying to right the tent, and I'm like, okay, well, at least it's, 4:30 in the morning. No one's going to see me. Of course, now I see headlights coming down. Somebody is driving at 4:30 in the morning through Bantam Lake, campgrounds, Point Folly, probably retreating. They probably just got, rained out and were going home or going to a hotel. But mysterious Bantam Lake driver, if you saw me, you probably have pictures. I don't know, but not a sight to see. Sorry. So I'm sorry if you had to see that. So I fix the tent again. I go back inside. It happens the third time, collapses. Now my son wakes up and he sees me, and he's telling me the story of the next day, of the image of me just in my sandals and nothing but my underwear and this clear cellophane, Reynolds wrap sort of cling wrap poncho and my bright headlamp. And at this point, I'm, my dad hears me from his tent and he's like, you got water? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, yep, told you so. So, Dad, you were right. You're still king camper. I should have gotten a bigger tarp. I learned my lesson. But anyway, my son and I get up out of bed. We run to the car and we finish sleeping in the car. And just keeps raining and raining and raining. And it probably didn't let up until 9:30 in the morning or so. And then we got out and my tent is just full of water. Our blankets and pillows are soaked. Our bags are soaked. Our clothes are soaked. Everything in my tent is just like kind of a complete loss. And we're checking the weather, and it's supposed to rain on and off all day. No sun. The high is supposed to be like 62. And that's the forecast for the next couple of days. I'm like, we can't even put our stuff out and dry out and at least salvage this trip. Like, we're just going to be wet the entire time. It's not going to get any better. So we woke up and we decided to pack up, and my tent was a loss. I had to cut a hole in the bottom just to drain the water. There was so much water in it, and it was an older tent. I'll buy a new one. It's probably over 20 years old at this point. I mean, I liked the tent, but I can probably get something a little lighter and more modern. But Dad, I know you're listening. You were right. I'm going to get a bigger tarp for next year. You were right. And you are king camper and you still have that title. So but anyway, my plan was to do a revisit of the Bantam Lake stuff because I've done some videos for this channel, both in podcast form, like with John on my own, and I also did like some bonus videos just for the YouTube channel for the Adirondacks, ODD, section of my site where it's all just me just camping, usually in the Adirondacks, but I threw in a Bantam Lake video. So I was going to like record a podcast up there. I was going to do some bonus content, but we had to get up the next morning and just leave. My dad's back was hurting. Everything was wet. Even even with his super tarp, he still got a little bit of water in their tent. And it's just not fun camping out there when it's going to rain all day. And it like rained the whole way home. It's tough to have a fire. It's tough to cook. It's tough to just sit out and enjoy. So yeah, we had to bail on that. So there's your horrifying story of our camping trip and the horrifying image of me being nearly naked, just in my underwear and this clear cellophane poncho and a giant headlamp and my bulky brown slippers, just trying to right my tent at 5 a.m. as somebody drove by the campground. So there's that. So I said, you know what? I'm still going to do a Bantam episode. I still want to do something about Connecticut because I do enjoy Bantam Lake. I do enjoy Connecticut. So I'm going to talk about some UFO stories today. Before we go any further, I just want to give a shout out to my buddy Andy from Spooky Island Radio. Great podcast. I listen to it all the time. I've mentioned him on the show many times before, but he had a little health scare last week. He was in the hospital, or almost 2 weeks ago now by the time this gets published. But he had a little health scare, went to the hospital. Turned out just to be like upper respiratory infection, but I'm glad he's on the mend. So Andy, buddy, get well soon. Hopefully you're better by the time you hear this. But just know I've been thinking about you, and I'm glad you're okay. So there's that. I want to give another shout out to my friend Courtney Maroc from Haunt Johns. I just did a show with her about haunted Staten Island locations where I currently live. I'm on Staten Island. So we did a really cool show about some of my favorite Staten Island locations for her show. So I'll put a link to that in the description below so you guys can find that if you want more of me. But Court and I have like this great rapport together and just always have a lot of fun. And it was a really good show. I watched it last night, and I'm biased, obviously, but she's just a great interview. She's always so much fun to talk to, and she just brings out the best in me. I just always feel so comfortable talking to her. I don't feel comfortable like this, like talking by myself. I feel more comfortable with a guest, but she always makes me feel super comfortable. She's just so much fun, and she's so gracious, and great show. So click the link below. You can find that episode as well if you're interested in Staten Island stuff. And a funny thing, I just wanted to talk about this. I'm drinking a beer today, and I'm going to show you guys here on the video. It's called Odd Pip, and this is from a brewery up in Maine called Odd Alewives. And this was a gift to me from my now ex-wife Laura, who goes up to Maine every year, and with her friend Katie Poopsie. And there's a lot of breweries up there, and they go to the Maine Brewing Company, and they go to Odd Alewives, which is like right near where they stay. And she brought me back some beer, and this is a really good one. This is Pip. It's a petite saison with Maine wheat, lemon, coriander, hints of pepper and citrus. I mean, it's really good. I've had it before, but she brought me like another 4-pack and another one, and I'll showcase those on another show. But this is Odd Pip, and I just thought it was cool because it's odd and untold, and it's Odd Alewives, and it's Odd Pip. So an odd beer for an odd podcast, or an odd cast. So there you go. So I'm going to get into the UFO stuff now, because that's what you're really here for. You don't want to hear about me in my underwear. So unless you do, you weirdos. So let's get to the UFO stories. All right, so I'm sharing my screen here, and this is an article from the Connecticut Insider, and they talk about 3 stories, and these, all of them, all 3. So the first one is like sort of relevant to my childhood, and I'll get into that. The second one I've discussed on the show before. It's the Bantam Lake UFO. And the third one has connections to Winsted, Connecticut, which I've talked about previously on the show, the Winsted Wildman, and I'll put that link in the description below so you guys can find that episode. Is about Bigfoot in Winsted, Connecticut. But I thought that was interesting to sort of tie this all together, that Connecticut, where I kind of vacation, has like weird stuff going on. So I'll get started with this. This is the first one we're going to talk about is the Westchester boomerang. And I'll just read from this site and then I'll give my input. So what people saw. In the early 1980s, particularly in 1983 and 1984, people reported hundreds of UFOs in the skies above Connecticut. The sightings primarily took place in Fairfield County and were most frequent in western Connecticut towns near the New York border, such as Danbury, New Fairfield, and Ridgefield. Over the border in Westchester and the Hudson Valley, sightings were equally common. As the New York Times reported in August 1984, throughout northern Westchester County, Dutchess and Putnam counties, and western Connecticut this summer, thousands of residents had reported strange objects in the sky, each usually in a V shape or a circle about the size of a football field, absolutely noiseless and outlined in brilliant lights of white, red, or green. So I'm going to stop there before we get into what probably happened. But I used to read this book repeatedly. I like reading books over and over again. And this was one of the books I used to read a lot, Night Siege by J. Allen Hynek and a few other authors. But Dr. J. Allen Hynek from Project Blue Book, the government-sponsored study of UFOs back from the 60s. And I remember reading this book, and I remember a lot of the town names sounded familiar because we passed through them on the way to Bantam. So it was like the Taconic Stake Parkway and Brewster, New York, and Danbury, Connecticut. So these were places that these sightings were happening. And I remember reading the book and just realizing that, wow, I passed right by these places. And as a kid, I was kind of stuck on Brooklyn. We didn't go many places far away. I mean, we'd go, down to Jersey but it was cool for me to kind of relate to these places and kind of see where they were and like drive through the same places where these sightings happened and just be able to visualize that without the internet, without, Google Street View and being able to pull that up just on a whim. So very cool for me as a kid to just read this book and then go up to Bantam every year and drive through these towns. We drive through Danbury. We go, near the Taconic. We'd go near, Mill River Parkway, all that stuff. So very cool. But now I'm going to get into what people say it was, and I'll talk about why I don't believe that. So what probably happened? As Jeff Lehman, spokesman for the Stewart International Airport in Orange County, told the Associated Press in October 1988, the majority of the Westchester boomerang sightings were caused by a group of pranking pilots flying in a formation that made them look like one craft. Lehman said the sightings coincided with when the airport knew these pilots were active, adding that the practice wasn't illegal but was annoying. I don't see scaring people with aircraft as a game, he said. However, in Night Siege, the Hudson Valley UFO sightings, the authors who had set up a hotline to track the UFO sightings claimed the hoaxing pilot story couldn't account for all the sightings. The second edition of Night Siege includes an account from Randy Edding, who says he saw a UFO in 1987 in Newtown while walking near his home. He saw a collection of strange lights in a semicircle and snapped a picture of them. Hundreds of others saw these lights, which were similar to what others had seen in the area a few years earlier, had the Westchester boomerang returned. So they addressed this in the book. The FAA kept saying, Federal Aviation Administration kept saying that these were just ultralight aircraft, pilots, hobbyists, I guess, with ultralight aircraft going out and flying in formation. And they do address this in the book, and they do talk about times when they did find that this may have been possible. But there's this right here, this description from what was seen, absolutely noiseless. Ultralight aircraft are basically like little gliders, and they have like a motor on them to spin the propeller, and it's essentially like a lawnmower engine, so very loud. And you're talking about Westchester County, Hudson River Valley, small towns in Connecticut. It's not noisy there, especially at night. You're going to hear these things. You're going to hear the motors. I mean, you're talking about 20 lawnmower engines up in the air, spinning propellers. It's not going to be noiseless. A lot of the sightings will claim that this thing hovered, this boomerang or this triangle or this circle hovered in place, that it blocked out the stars, that you couldn't see, stars between the lights. The ultralight aircraft usually, they're small. They're not, passenger jets, airlines. They're small, so they do have lights on them. They're not going to be these bright, brilliant things that people mistake for UFOs. Were a lot of these sightings probably these ultralight aircraft? Of course, because they could match up certain sightings with when these pilots were out there, but there's so many of them that were not. So there is this UFO flap up there that can't be fully explained. And it just comes across with the skeptics saying, oh, it's all these ultralight aircraft. And while that can account for a vast majority of them, again, use Occam's razor, like I talked about a few weeks ago, it doesn't account for all of them. And a lot of these sightings were not just one person saying this. It wasn't just one guy out there who may have been drinking that night and said he saw something. I mean, a lot of these craft were seen by dozens and dozens of people. I mean, if you read the book, you hear accounts of just cars pulling over on the road and people getting out and watching this craft move. And I don't think that would happen if this is just ultralight aircraft. And again, you're talking about staying in tight formation, a circle, a V shape. And you're talking about dozens and dozens of people going up in these aircraft at the same time. And, again, curiously, you don't hear people admitting to that. So are they hoaxing? Are they being annoying? Again, a lot of it probably could be hoaxes or just misidentifications, but there are instances where these craft were seen to be hovering, stationary, which an ultralight aircraft couldn't do. Like I said, it's basically a little, homemade glider with a tiny engine attached to it. And again, these days they use electric. They're probably a little quieter, but you're talking the early 80s, like they were loud. They were very loud. So that is story number one. So we'll move on to story number two. Okay, so story number two, the green whale of Bantam Lake. And again, I've talked about this one. I did a video on it by myself. I did a podcast episode. I did a bonus episode for the YouTube channel. So if you're listening on audio, head over to the YouTube channel. You'll find where me, my dad, and my son go out on the lake, and we take an EMF detector. We take magnets. We try to see if we can just find anything where this thing allegedly crashed, and we didn't, spoiler alert, but it's a cool video. You can kind of see us out there camping and being out on the boats and on the lake. And but so I have talked about this before, but I want to go over it again because I do think it bears some analysis and is worthy of some analysis. So I'm going to read from the article once again. The green whale of Bantam Lake, what people saw. In the early morning hours of April 10th, 2012, an unidentified motorist called State Police Barracks to report a whale-sized glowing green object fall into Bantam Lake. The motorist, who has never been identified, likely would have been dismissed as a prankster or magic mushroom consumer, had an on-duty state trooper about 10 miles away in Warren not also called the station to report seeing a large object fall from the sky over Bantam or Morris. So again, before I go into explanations, I just want to talk about this. So this story, I've blogged about it. I've done podcasts. I've done bonus videos. I've talked about this a lot. There's a shocking dearth of information about this case. I mean, it's out there. You can find this story out there. I've talked about it probably more than anybody, but the story is out there. But there's a lack of information. We don't know the witness's name. I don't believe the state trooper has ever been named. This has been in the newspapers. I believe it was on a TV show once, the UFO Files, or one of those shows on Travel Channel or Discovery or whatever. And they talked to some witnesses, and there were people who live on Bantam Lake who say that there were waves that, and at night, Bantam Lake is very calm. It's like glass, unless it's super windy. But they were saying that there were waves coming up on shore. So I don't know. So there's two sides of the story where it's out there. You have the state trooper, you have this other witness. I mean, calls were made, and I guess journalists have confirmed this, but we don't have the names, so it's hard to sort of do follow-up. And it's kind of taken on like this urban legend aura right now, because again, there's no names, there's no real way to sort of check on this. I don't believe the lake was searched. I've heard it was, I've heard it wasn't, I've heard people saw scuba divers going in, I've heard nobody saw anything after this. So I don't know what it was, but they're saying a whale-sized object, which would be fairly large. And I was talking to my dad about this while we were camping, the 24 hours we did actually get to camp this year, roughly. And I had mentioned that something that big, usually when you have a meteorite fall, It's something small, something crashes through someone's roof and it's a little tiny hunk of rock. You're talking about something the size of a whale. This would do some damage. It would make some noise. Like, people would hear this. There would be some sort of after effect. Even if it hit the lake, you're talking probably huge amounts of water coming up on land, people being flooded. That is a large meteorite. So we're going to get into what probably happened, what this article says. So, what, if anything, fell from the heavens has never been determined, and no search of the lake has been conducted to date. But there are some plausible possibilities that, unfortunately, don't involve green men or whales. Brian Koberlein, an astrophysicist and author, has written about how meteoroids and asteroids can glow green when they enter the Earth's atmosphere as the iron nickel in the object burns up. And yeah, I mean, anybody who's used a Bunsen burner in, chemistry class in high school knows this. Given the background of this story, he says he thinks the meteor is the culprit. Meteorites usually burn up or cool down before getting close to Earth's surface, so a green, glowing meteor would still be pretty high. But given your vantage point, it can seem as if it's close to the ground. It's hard to judge position and scale in the night sky, he says. Case in point, when the moon is low on the horizon, it looks huge, but it is the same size it always is. Same with meteors sometimes. They can look big, bright, and low to the ground when they are actually further away and appear near the horizon. Given the little information available, the object was almost certainly a meteor. It happened during the Lyrid meteor shower, and green glowing meteors aren't particularly rare. Dr. Stephen Nicolescu, collections manager for the Mineralogy and Meteoritics Division at Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History in New Haven, doubts a meteorite fell into the lake. Neither of the two witnesses reported hearing any sound, which I was getting at, let alone loud bangs. Even small meteorites generate a sonic boom, he says. The last documented meteorite fall in Connecticut occurred in 2013, and though the meteorite pieces recovered in Walcott and Waterbury were only a few pounds, a boom was heard on the Connecticut shoreline. Asked to speculate, Nicolescu offers space debris or the Northern Lights as possibilities, but thinks both might be a stretch. The sighting, if it ever happened, remains a mystery, he said. So, yeah, I mean, my guess was always that it was a meteorite. But there are aspects of this story that bother me. Basically, specifically, that there was no sonic boom, there was no loud bang. There was a couple of witnesses. One was a woman driving, apparently, and one was a state trooper out at night, seeing this thing fall into Bantam Lake. And for me, I think if someone is seeing a meteorite, a shooting star way in the distance, one, it was bright enough where they thought it fell into Bantam Lake. So let's assume that two different people who don't know each other think they saw something fall into Bantam Lake. If this were far away, something would have fallen far away, and we would have known about that, a meteorite fell over here. Maybe that's what they were seeing. As far as I can tell, and from my research, I don't think anything else fell that night. There were no other witnesses. So something allegedly fell into the lake. And again, there are witnesses out there who will say that there were waves. So what fell into it? Now, of course, it's possible that she saw something whale-sized. I've heard other stories say that it was whale-shaped. So maybe oblong, maybe thicker at the front and then tapering towards the end. I don't know. Again, it's very hard to do follow-up on this story because it's hard to find the witnesses and figure out what exactly they saw. And again, different articles will say whale-shaped or whale-sized, and that's two very different things. I can have, I have this like little thumb drive here that is kind of whale-shaped. It's thicker at the front and then tapers at the back. So it's roughly whale-shaped, but I mean, it's, an inch and a half long. That's what she said. But whale-sized is very different because now you're talking very large, and if something that large had hit the Earth, I think we'd have known about it. It would have made a lot of noise and caused a lot of damage. So we're left with a mystery. Space debris, possible, because you're not talking that it's entering the Earth's atmosphere with the same speed as like a meteorite would. And I've heard that even just meteorites the size of a Volkswagen Beetle could cause a crater, like that's coming into the Earth's atmosphere very fast. And when it impacts, it's going to cause some problems. So something the size of a whale is going to cause problems. Space debris, possible, but I do think if it were space debris, there would have been some sort of search of the lake. Somebody would have gone out there to try to get this. whether it was ours, whether it was a foreign nation's. We're going to try to retrieve that. You can't just leave that laying in a lake where people swim and go jet skiing and go fishing. It's just very strange. The Northern Lights, we don't really see the Northern Lights here. I mean, in the past year or so, there's been some very rare instances of being able to see the Northern Lights. If you go way up, like maybe into the Adirondacks, if you go where there's like very little light pollution, Bantam Lake has a lot of light pollution. There's towns all around. And when I was a kid in the 80s, you can kind of see the Milky Way. You can see a lot of stars. Now you go up there, it's slightly better than here in New York City. There's just a lot of light pollution. You don't see the sky as well as you used to. And 2012, I was camping there. It wasn't great for the light pollution. So Northern Lights, I don't think so. Just having another sip of beer here. So let's go on to the last story, because this is pretty cool. So this is the Great Airship Sightings. And I've mentioned airships before. I've done some stories about, the Winstead Wildman. I've done the Bigfoot sightings in New York City. A lot of yellow journalism in the 1800s and even into the early 1900s. So you got to be real careful. And there were things like wild men and airships that later morphed into, of course, Bigfoot and UFOs or UAPs, whatever they're called now. So let me read this story, and then we'll kind of get into what I think. So what people saw. Above Willimantic in the early morning hours of January 7th, 1910, John H. Gray, an opera house manager, and John Manley, a policeman, saw emerging out of the black, starless sky something that resembled a chain of electric lights hitched together with a strand of fire. Gray estimated the lights, which seemed to hover, were about 50 feet long. They could have been some type of comet, he said, or an airship stopped for repairs. From December 1909 to January 1910, people across Connecticut and other parts of New England reported seeing a mysterious airship with similar characteristics. They believed it was a revolutionary new aircraft created by a Massachusetts businessman. So again, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you have a lot of these mysterious things in the air. You had airships, you had some flying humanoids. I talked about that too as well, from Coney Island. What were they? The Wright brothers hadn't really created or invented airplanes yet and flight, but people were seeing these airships, just these things in the air that had, not only floated and hovered and just sort of defied physics, but also had lights. And that is just an interesting thing to me, because we could barely electrify our homes at that point, but these airships had bright lights and searchlights and things that just sound very advanced and very electric and not like just lit up by candles. So very strange. So let me read their thoughts on what probably happened. In the late 1800s, U.S. observers began seeing phantom or mystery airships, as I mentioned. The ships were often described in an eerily similar manner to later accounts of UFOs. They were thought to be the inventions of aeronautic pioneers who had yet to share their genius with the world. And I'll get back to that. The 1909 wave of sightings began on December 12th after Wallace Tillinghast, a Worcester businessman, told a Boston Herald reporter that he had invented the world's first reliable, heavier-than-air flying machine. He said that during one of the many recent flights, he had flown it from Worcester to New York, around the Statue of Liberty, and then over Boston, far exceeding what the aviators of the day, including the Wright brothers, could accomplish. Within a month, after reporters stalked out Tillinghast's home, it became clear that his airship didn't exist, but that didn't stop hundreds of people from seeing it. Many mistook the planet Venus, which was unusually bright, for the airship. Other sightings were caused by hoaxers who read Tillinghast's boasts and released fire balloons to prank their neighbors. On New Year's Day, Edwin Hitchcock, in a prison warden in Winstead, so there's my connection to the Winstead Wildman, and his friends released a balloon at the same time as they blanketed the area with the handbills that read, January 1st, 1910, on my way to New York, and were signed by Tillinghast. Many were fooled by this hoax on top of a hoax. So, weird stuff going on here. So, again, skeptics are going to point to a couple of things here. So the first one is, people will talk about the inventions of aeronautic pioneers. So all these guys who are out there creating flying suits and airships, but never sought a patent, never showed it off to the world. Tillinghast himself made these claims that he went down to New York and flew around the Statue of Liberty and then back up And where's the proof? Where's your airship? Didn't exist. Um, so you have these guys claiming this, or skeptics saying that that's probably what it was, or it was a hot air balloon or whatever. But people were familiar with those things. These were something different. These were airships. This was something, they almost sound like blimps or zeppelins. And it's, again, possible that that's what they were, but I find it hard to believe that so many entrepreneurs were flying blimps with lights, electric lights and spotlights, and hovering without engines, without making sound. And so many of them did this, but not a single one of them took credit for it. And the one or two people who did take credit for it couldn't prove it. They're just boasting. The whole thing about Venus, that's just the standard skeptics way to debunk things. You saw Venus. Mothman is an owl. Bigfoot is an owl. It's owls, it's Venus, it's swamp gas. There's just like the standard, deck of cards that skeptics will pull from. And it's Venus, it's this, it's owls, it's swamp gas, mass hallucination. And that's probably what they're going to say the Hudson Valley ones were, the boomerang UFO up in Connecticut and New York. There was a lot of that. They were just saying mass hallucinations. And I don't buy that people driving on the highway are all going to pull over and look up into the sky and they're all going to see the same thing because of a mass hallucination. Doesn't really work that way. So yeah, I thought it was interesting that you have this little connection to Winstead with the Winstead Wild Man. But it just show that there's these UFO sightings going back in Connecticut to the late 1800s, early 1900s. Things crashed into Bantam Lake, apparently. And just on the way up to Bantam Lake, there's been UFO sightings. So just my whole sort of stretch from Staten Island or Brooklyn at the time up to Bantam Lake and back has just a lot of UFO history. So very cool. And hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I'm going to cut it short there for this week because I just wanted to talk about those three stories. And I rambled on enough about my Bantam Lake escapades this year. So, Andy, hope you're doing great, my friend. Hope you're feeling better. And lessons for the kids this week. Listen to your fathers. They always know, even when you're 49 years old like me, Dad, you were right. I needed a bigger tarp. So that is lesson number one from this episode. Listen to your fathers. Listen to your parents. They know better, even when you're an adult. And I'm a father myself now, but I still have things to learn. And I got a little cocky. I thought my tent would handle it. I thought my tarp would handle it. And I was wrong. And my dad got, a couple of drops of water in his tent where I was flooded out and I have to buy a new tent now. Lesson number two, kids, you can get divorced and still get nice gifts from your ex. And you can be friends, and we are friends, and we get along great. And it's just wonderful that we can do this beer exchange with each other and just text each other once in a while and have a laugh and share a laugh. So lesson number two, you can break up with somebody and not be a dick. So everybody should learn that lesson. And until next week, everybody, Odd Pip here, rock and roll.